Okay, in this section, I'm going to make a few videos that kind of highlight some of the key ideas from this chapter, and then I'll let you read about the rest in the textbook. I would still suggest you read these sections to add on more depth that I may not have included in this section, but this is just meant to kind of facilitate your learning. So one of the first debates we have that we can see in academia is about this nature versus nurture when we're coming to gender roles. Okay, so how much of gender roles is something about nature or scientific, and how much is based on the social conditions in which, or economic conditions in which someone lives. So I'm going to start by just giving you the two sides that are presented in your textbook, and then I'll talk a little bit about the approach we're going to take in this class. Okay, so one side is coming from a field known as evolutionary psychology, also known as sociobiology sometimes. And so the view of this field is basically that our genes have evolved over time to determine our behavioral traits of humans. Okay, so these traits determine our behavior, and there's evidence that like quite a few of our behaviors are sort of, even though we think we're kind of thinking of them rationally, they're actually determined by our genes. Okay, and so then this goes further than, well, that this idea is that women and men are adapted biologically to different roles in the ancient world, and so then this biological markers, these biological differences are in our genes, and they influence our behavior even today, even though the reality has changed, but this biological aspect is still there. Okay, so this is the basic idea. So let me write this down. So people were playing very specialized roles in the ancient world, and they're adapted biologically for this. And especially, this would be especially around roles that were determined by having children and raising children, because this would have been much of women's lives were spent in this activity when family sizes were really big and in the absence of any form of birth control. Now, this idea is that, so even if other things have changed, that these genetic differences are still there, and so this idea is basically that this is going to limit people's ability to adapt to changing circumstances. Okay, so the basic idea of this is that while there's differences between men and women are biological, and so therefore will adapt very slowly, if at all, in the short run. Okay, very slowly, or if at all, in a human lifespan, to changes in the economy. Okay, so even though the economy is changing, this viewpoint is basically that these things are not really changing, at least not on the scale of a human life, and therefore these are kind of a limiting factor. There's another viewpoint, and this viewpoint is called the social structural approach, or social structure approach, and this is basically that yes, there are some biological differences, some more obvious than others, but the social environment and the culture plays a big role in determining gender roles and behaviors. Okay, so we're not denying that there's some biological differences. This emphasizes the role of social environment and culture in determining our gender roles and our behavior. And one of the pieces of evidence for this is to see how gender roles differ in different countries, okay, or how gender roles differ over time. So, for example, you might find that something which is a very gendered occupation in one time and place could actually be so it's almost primarily done by men or almost primarily done by women, but in a different place or a different time, the situation might be reversed. Okay, so that in one society it's almost totally done by women, and another society it's almost totally done by men, right? And so that would be evidence for the social structure approach that these things can change as the situation changes, right? And they're determined not just by genetics, but they're also determined by the social environment and the culture, right? So the key ideas coming from this field, one is that people have a capacity to change. Okay, so that's one. People have capacity to adapt their behavior to the changing circumstances. And another key idea is that technology is eliminating or reducing the importance of biological differences. Okay, so technology has made biological differences less important because most work is office work. It doesn't require tremendous physical strength. If there is difference, for example, in absolute max strength for lifting heavy objects, there tends on average to be a difference between men and women. So this technology is making the biological differences less important. Okay. Also, there's other types of technology, for example, related to birth control, etc., that have also freed women from this cycle of almost always having young children, right? Throughout their 20s and 30s, almost always having a young child at home. So this has freed women from this cycle. This technology is related to birth control. So this is another important thing. So technology is kind of minimizing some of these biological differences that may exist. And the third point is even in areas with different averages. So there might be areas where, yes, it's obvious that men and women on average are different in this area. There's still considerable overlap in their distributions. And this is an important thing to keep in point to keep in mind throughout the course. So we want to make sure we are remember that groups are made up of individuals and that individuals are unique. So in areas with different averages, there's a considerable overlap in the distribution. Okay, and I'll draw a little picture to show what I mean by this. Oops. Okay, so let's draw a little picture to see what I mean by this. So, okay, one thing that I think is true in every human society, at least as far as I know, is that on average, men are taller than women. Okay, so let's make women can be, I don't know, green. So let's suppose this is the height distribution. So most people are somewhere in the middle. This is women. And then let's make this the height distribution for men. I should have put my heights a little differently. Okay, this is men. Okay, so this is the height distribution. And yes, it's true that their averages are different, but it's also true that there's lots of overlap. So there's lots of area of men who are shorter than some women. There's also lots of area of women who are taller than average men. So there's lots of overlap going on. So when we talk about individuals, we need to be careful that we're not stereotyping them based on the average of their groups, but we're actually recognizing individuals for who they are. So our class is going to be much closer to the social structure approach. So our class will be much closer to the social structure approach. And basically the idea, the reason why here, we're kind of, in a way, we're kind of staying out of the debate, partly because as economists, it's not our specialty field to be able to delve into biology and genetics and psychology and human behavior and all this. It's not exactly, especially the genetics and biology part, it's not really our field. So we kind of stay out of this. So we just basically leave open to the possibility that current behaviors or roles can change. Okay, so we're leaving this open. We're not closing the door or anything. We're also not assuming how they will change. We got to kind of see how they do when we look at data or look at society. But we're leaving open the possibility that they can change, right? We're not closing that door by buying into a theory that basically says they can't change, because then there would be nothing for us to study. Okay, and secondly, so we also noticed that, I probably should have put this color to start with, we noticed that men and women are getting closer and closer together. Okay, oops, they're getting closer together in roles, education, life choices. Okay, and this is so this is again further evidence for the social structure approach that if it was all biology, it doesn't seem like they would be able to get closer and closer in terms of their behavior and their roles, etc. And the final thing is, in this class, where I want to always keep in mind and this was illustrated by the graph above, that groups are made up of unique individuals. So, so even if we know something about the average in a certain group, that doesn't really tell us anything about an individual, because the individual can be very, very different than the average of their group. So I'll come back in another video and talk a little bit about a big picture of the relationship between gender and economic development.